My son wrote, "I've decided to sell your house to pay for my vacation with my wife. You have 24 hours to pack your things." I just smiled and handed over the keys. He had no idea that the house was actually— Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. There are houses that hold you the way arms cannot. My house on Clover Street was like that. A white two-story colonial with green shutters, a porch that creaked in the same spot near the railing for 30 years, and a kitchen that smelled of coffee and old wood, no matter the season. Frank and I had bought it in 1987, young and foolish and full of plans. We raised Derek there, painted his bedroom ceiling with glow-in-the-dark stars, buried 2 dogs in the backyard under the old oak. And when Frank passed of a heart attack 11 years ago, I stayed, because leaving felt like dying twice. I kept the porch light on. I kept his chair at the kitchen table. I kept going. For most of those years, Derek had been a decent enough son. Not warm. He inherited Frank's jawline, but not his kindness. But present. He called on birthdays. He came for Thanksgiving when it suited him. After he married Tiffany 6 years ago, the visits thinned. She was a woman who calculated everything, including affection. I noticed it but said nothing. You learn, at 68, which battles to pick. The first signal came in February, about a year before everything unraveled. Derek called on a Tuesday. Unusual, since he normally only called on Sundays, and only briefly. His voice had that particular flatness it got when he was managing something, the same tone he used when he told me Frank's funeral arrangements were handled. He asked casually whether I had updated my will recently. I said I hadn't thought about it. He said I should. He recommended his own attorney, a man named Garrett, whose card he offered to mail me. I thanked him and hung up, and sat for a long moment at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold. I told myself it was reasonable. I was 67 at the time. It was a practical question. But the calls continued. Over the following months, Derek began asking other things. Had I considered downsizing? A woman my age, alone in a 4-bedroom house. Wasn't it a lot of upkeep? Tiffany's parents had moved into a senior community in Scottsdale and were, apparently, thriving. Had I looked into anything like that? There was one in Columbus with a lovely common area and organized activities. I had not looked into anything like that. Then came the visit in October. They arrived on a Saturday with a bottle of wine neither of them intended to share generously, and a mood I can only describe as prospecting. Tiffany walked through the downstairs rooms with her eyes doing arithmetic. She touched the fireplace mantel. She stood in the doorway of the dining room and said, "You know, with the right updates, this place would photograph beautifully." I asked her what she meant. She smiled and said, "Oh, just, it has good bones." Derek said nothing. He watched me the way he used to watch his father before asking to borrow the car. I began to pay attention differently after that. I went back through small moments I had discarded. The time Derek asked whether I still had the original deed paperwork, just for estate planning. The time Tiffany mentioned a real estate agent friend of hers who specialized in helping families transition properties smoothly. The time Derek asked, with manufactured casualness, whether the mortgage was fully paid off. It was. Had been since 2009. I started keeping a small notebook. I wrote things down. Dates, phrases, tones. I am not a dramatic woman. I do not catastrophize. But I am the daughter of a woman who survived things by paying attention, and I had begun to feel, in my chest, the particular cold that comes before something breaks. And then, on a Thursday morning in March, my phone buzzed with a text from Derek. I read it standing in my kitchen, in my robe, with my first cup of coffee in my hand. "Mom, Tiffany and I have made a decision. We're going to sell the house to cover our vacation expenses and some other things we've been putting off. You have 24 hours to gather your things. We've already been in contact with a realtor. I read it 3 times. Then I set down my coffee, very carefully, so it wouldn't spill. And I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. It did, in the deep, wordless way only your children can hurt you. But because in that moment, standing in Frank's kitchen, in the house we had built together, I realized that Derek had just made the worst mistake of his life. He didn't know what I knew. He didn't know what the house actually was, and I had no intention of telling him yet. I went to find my keys. I drove to Carol's. Carol Whitman had been my closest friend since 1994, when our sons played Little League on the same team, and we spent an entire summer sitting on aluminum bleachers, complaining about the heat. She was a retired paralegal. Not a lawyer, she always clarified, but she knew more about property law than most people who were. I had called her from the car, hands steady on the wheel despite everything, and by the time I pulled into her driveway on Elmwood, she had coffee ready and her reading glasses on the table. I showed her the text. She read it once. Then she read it again. She set the phone down and looked at me over her glasses with an expression I recognized, the one she reserved for things that were both absurd and serious at the same time. "He thinks he can sell your house," she said. It was not a question. "Apparently. Based on what exactly? Does he have power of attorney? Is he on the deed?" "No," I said. "And no." Carol folded her hands on the table. "Then what does he think gives him the right?" That was the question, wasn't it? That was the thing I had turned over in my mind for the entire 15-minute drive. The cold, practical question underneath all the grief. Derek was not stupid. He had a business degree. He knew, in theory, how property ownership worked, which meant either he had been badly advised or he knew something I didn't, or, and this was the possibility that made my coffee taste like metal, someone had helped him believe he had grounds that he didn't. I told Carol everything. The phone calls over the past year, the October visit, Tiffany's eyes measuring my rooms, the questions about the deed, the mortgage, the will. Carol listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When I finished, she said, "Maggie, has anyone had access to your mail? Your documents?" I thought about it. The previous summer, Derek had stayed for 4 days while Tiffany visited her sister. He had slept in the guest room. He had been alone in the house on 2 mornings while I was at my garden club. The filing cabinet in the study, I had never locked it. Why would I? It was my house. The cold in my chest spread. "The filing cabinet," I said. Carol nodded slowly. "I think you need to do 2 things today. First, you need to call your attorney, not Garrett, your own attorney, the one Frank used. What's his name? Henderson. Bill Henderson. Call Bill Henderson today. And second," she paused, choosing her words, "I think you need to go home and go through every document in that filing cabinet and figure out what Derek has seen, and more importantly, what he thinks he saw." I drove home. The house felt different when I walked back in, not smaller, but watched, as if the rooms themselves were holding their breath. I went directly to the study. The filing cabinet was a 4-drawer gray steel thing, nothing special, tucked beside Frank's old desk. I opened the top drawer. Everything looked undisturbed. But that means nothing. Photographs look undisturbed. Documents look undisturbed. You would only know something had been examined if something had been moved carelessly, and Derek, whatever his faults, had never been careless. I went through every folder. It took 2 hours, and I found what I was looking for. Or rather, I found what was missing. There was a folder, 3rd drawer, labeled simply House. Misk. Frank had made it. It contained old insurance documents, a survey from 1991, a copy of the original purchase agreement. What it did not contain, what I was almost certain it had once contained, was a handwritten note from Frank's mother, Eleanor Calloway, written in 1989. Eleanor had been a shrewd woman. She had lent us $40,000 toward the down payment, a significant sum in 1989, and had insisted, quietly and without fanfare, on a specific arrangement, not a gift, not a loan in the traditional sense, a legal instrument that Bill Henderson had drawn up and that all three of us had signed, a life estate arrangement with a private trust structure that Frank and I had formalized in 2003. The house was not simply mine in the colloquial sense. It was held in a trust of which I was the sole trustee and sole beneficiary during my lifetime. A trust that explicitly, could not be transferred, sold, or encumbered by any heir without my written, notarized consent, and only after my death. Derek could no more sell my house than he could sell the moon. But if he had found only the purchase agreement, only the mortgage payoff document, only the surface layer, he might have convinced himself otherwise. Or someone might have convinced him. I sat at Frank's desk for a long time. The fear was real. I will not pretend it wasn't. Not fear of Derek, exactly, but fear of what it meant that my son had looked at my home and seen an asset to liquidate. Fear of what Tiffany had built in him over 6 years. Fear of how far they were willing to go. But underneath the fear, and this surprised me, was something harder. I had spent 40 years building something. Frank and I together, and then me alone. And I was not going to let it be taken by a man who thought 24 hours was a reasonable notice for his mother to vacate her life. I picked up the phone and called Bill Henderson. "Bill," I said when he answered, "I need to see you tomorrow morning. Something has come up with the house. I need to know exactly where we stand legally, and I need to know what my options are." Bill was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "First thing tomorrow, Maggie, 8 o'clock. I hung up. I looked around the study. At Frank's books still on the shelves. At the glow in the dark stars we'd never taken down from Derek's old bedroom ceiling, visible through the open door across the hall. Then I opened my notebook to a fresh page and I began to write. The plan was just an outline at that point, but it was a beginning. Bill Henderson's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Main Street that hadn't changed its facade since 1978. The elevator still had the original brass buttons. I had been coming here since Frank was alive, for wills and deed transfers and the occasional neighborly dispute, and the smell of the place, old paper and lemon polish, had always meant safety to me. Competence. Order. Bill was already at his desk when his assistant showed me in. 71 years old, trim, with reading glasses perpetually halfway down his nose. He had known Frank. He had drafted the trust documents himself. I sat down and told him everything. He did not look alarmed, which itself was steadying. He listened, made 2 notes on a legal pad, and then pulled up the trust documentation on his computer. He had scanned everything years ago, meticulous man, and walked me through it, point by point. The structure was exactly as I remembered. The house at 412 Clover Street was held in the Margaret and Francis Calloway Revocable Living Trust, established in 2003, amended in 2011, following Frank's death to make me the sole trustee. As trustee, I had complete control. No co-trustee. No beneficiary rights during my lifetime. Derek was named as the successor beneficiary, meaning he would inherit upon my death. But that right conveyed absolutely nothing to him while I was alive. He could not sell, could not encumber, could not even legally list the property. Any action he takes to sell this property, Bill said quietly, without your written and notarized consent, would constitute attempted fraud, potentially wire fraud, if he's communicated with a realtor in writing. He mentioned a realtor in the text, I said. Bill looked at me over his glasses. Do you still have that text? I screenshot it. He nodded slowly. Maggie, I want you to do something for me. I want you to do nothing outwardly for the next few days. Don't respond to Derek. Don't confirm or deny anything. Let me make some quiet inquiries. He paused. Do you know the name of the realtor he's supposedly been in contact with? I didn't, but I knew how to find out. I left Bill's office at 9:15 and sat in my car for a moment on Main Street, watching the morning go about its business. A woman walked a dog. The hardware store opened its door. Everything ordinary. Everything indifferent to the fact that my son had tried to sell my house. I drove home and did something I was not proud of, but which I would do again. I called Derek's number and let it go to voicemail, then immediately sent a text saying only, "Got your message. I'm thinking. Can you give me the realtor's contact info so I can understand the timeline?" It was a small deception. I was not thinking in the way he would have understood it, but I needed the name. He texted back within 4 minutes, which told me how eager he was. Her name is Stacy Vollmer, Vollmer Realty. She already has the address and is ready to move quickly. Just let us know when you're out. I saved the screenshot. I forwarded it to Bill. Then I called Carol. He's already in contact with a realtor, I told her. He gave me her name. Carol was quiet for a moment. That's not just an impulsive text anymore, Maggie. That's coordinated. She was right. The text on Thursday morning hadn't been a burst of cruelty or a thoughtless power move. It had been a deployment. They had already spoken to Stacy Vollmer. They had already discussed timelines. The 24 hours wasn't a threat. It was a schedule. That afternoon, I did something I had been putting off. I went through the rest of the filing cabinet with fresh eyes, not looking for what was missing now, but looking for anything that might tell me when Derek had been in it. And in the back of the 4th drawer, tucked behind a folder of old tax returns, I found something that made my hands go still. A photocopy. It was a photocopy of the original purchase agreement from 1987. The surface document, the one that listed Frank and me as buyers, that showed the purchase price and the mortgage terms. It did not include the trust amendment. It did not include Eleanor's arrangement. It showed only the simplest version of the transaction. 2 people bought a house. Someone had made this copy and left it behind. Carelessly, or perhaps deliberately. A record of what they had looked at. The paper had a faint crease pattern consistent with being folded into thirds, the way you would fold something to fit in a jacket pocket. Derek had made this copy during those 4 days last summer. He had stood in Frank's study, at Frank's desk, and photographed or copied this document and taken it with him. And he had built his entire plan on it. On the assumption that the purchase agreement was the whole story. He had never found the trust documents. He didn't know they existed. I sat very still. Then I put the photocopy in a separate envelope, labeled it with the date I found it, and put it in my purse. That evening, Carol came over for dinner. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had read Derek's text that Thursday morning, and I laid out everything. Bill's confirmation of the trust, the text exchange with Derek, Stacy Vollmer's name, the photocopy. Carol looked at the photocopy for a long time. "He went through your papers," she said. "Yes." "And he built a case on an incomplete document." "Yes." She looked up at me. "Maggie, do you understand what you have here?" I did. I had documentation of his intent. I had evidence of coordinated action with a third party. I had proof that he had accessed my private documents without permission, and I had a legal structure so solid that not a single thing he planned could succeed, not one, without my signature. He had handed me everything I needed. The question now was not whether I could protect the house. The question was what I wanted to do with what I knew. I thought about it that night, lying in my bedroom, looking at the ceiling. By morning, I knew the answer. The first thing I did was call Bill Henderson and tell him to proceed. We had outlined 3 steps during our meeting, and I had spent the night confirming in my own mind that I wanted all 3. The first was a formal cease and desist letter to Derek, sent by Bill's office, informing him that the property at 412 Clover Street was held in trust, that he had no legal standing to initiate or coordinate any sale, and that any further contact with real estate agents, potential buyers, or financial institutions regarding this property would constitute actionable fraud. The second was a formal letter to Stacy Vollmer of Vollmer Realty, informing her of the trust structure and putting her on notice that any listing of the property without trustee consent would expose her and her brokerage to legal liability. The third, and this one I had added the night before, was a formal inquiry to the county recorder's office requesting confirmation that no unauthorized documents had been filed against the property. That last one was Carol's suggestion. People do strange things when they think they have momentum, she had said. Make sure he hasn't tried to file anything. He hadn't. The county recorder confirmed it within 48 hours. The cease and desist letters went out on a Wednesday. By Friday afternoon, Derek called. I was in the garden when the phone rang. Early April, the tulips just coming up along the front walk. The air still carrying winter underneath its surface warmth. I looked at his name on the screen. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. Mom. His voice was controlled, but only just. I had heard that tone before, when he was a teenager and I had caught him in something he couldn't talk his way out of. The controlled voice was always a sign that something underneath it was not controlled at all. I got a letter from a lawyer. I know, I said. I sent it. Silence. Then, what is this? What is this trust? I've never heard of any trust. You were never meant to administer it, I said pleasantly. You're a beneficiary, Derek, a future one. That's different from having rights. You're doing this to spite me. I'm doing this because you contacted a realtor about my home without my knowledge or consent. You gave me 24 hours to leave. I'm responding appropriately. More silence. When he spoke again, the control had slipped a notch. Tiffany says this can be challenged. She says trusts like this can be contested. Tiffany is welcome to consult an attorney, I said. She'll be told the same thing Bill Henderson will tell you if you call him directly. This trust is valid, properly recorded, and unassailable. There is nothing to contest. He hung up. I stood among my tulips for a moment. Then I went back inside. The escalation came on Saturday. They arrived at the house at 11 in the morning. Both of them, unannounced, their car pulling into my driveway with the particular aggression of people who have decided that showing up in person is a form of argument. I watched them from the kitchen window for a moment before opening the door. Derek was taut with something, anger or embarrassment, or the particular species of shame that looks like anger. Tiffany was composed in the manner of someone who has rehearsed. She was wearing the kind of casual blazer that is specifically chosen to signal that one is serious. I opened the door before they knocked. I didn't invite you, I said, not unkindly, simply as a fact. We need to talk, Derek said. Then you should have called first. I did not step back from the door. What do you want to say? What followed was 30 minutes that I will not recount in full, because the details were repetitive and the emotional texture was deeply unpleasant. Derek told me I was being unreasonable. Tiffany, in her practiced voice, explained that they had financial obligations that I was making impossible to address. She suggested that the trust was probably outdated and that surely, as family, we could come to an arrangement. She used the word arrangement 4 times. At one point, Derek said, "You're going to die in that house alone and leave it to what? A charity?" I looked at him for a moment. "I might," I said. "That's my right." Then Tiffany's composure cracked, just briefly, and she said something I had not expected. "We know you have money in that account from when Frank's mother died. We know about the inheritance." I kept my face very still, because Eleanor Calloway had not left a public estate. Her assets had passed through a private trust directly to me in 2018. It was not a matter of public record. The only way Tiffany could know about it, the only way, was if Derek had told her. And the only way Derek could know was if he had found something in my files. "I think you should leave now," I said. Derek stepped forward. Not threateningly, but the step was meant to signal something. "We're not done." "You are on my property," I said very quietly. "You were asked to leave. If you don't leave, I'll call the police." Not as a dramatic gesture, as a practical one. Something in my voice, or perhaps Bill Henderson's letter still fresh in his mind, made Derek stop. They left. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long moment, my hand on the wall, letting my pulse settle. Then I did something I had not done in several years. I called my daughter-in-law, Sandra, Frank's niece, really, but we had always called her that, who lived in Cincinnati, and I told her I needed a few days away. She said, "Come now, Maggie. Come tonight." I packed a bag. I asked Carol to check on the house. I drove to Cincinnati on Saturday evening, and I spent 4 days in Sandra's spare room, walking her dog in the mornings, eating dinner with her family in the evenings, and letting my mind rest from the weight of my own home. I needed it, not as retreat, as preparation. When I drove back on Wednesday, I felt the difference. The cold in my chest had settled into something quieter, more deliberate, something that knew exactly what it was doing. I came home to a full voicemail box, 3 messages from Derek, left across the 4 days I was gone. The first was formal, something about working this out like adults. The second was warmer, almost cajoling, with a tone I recognized from his childhood when he wanted something and had decided that niceness might work where arguing had not. The third was Tiffany, not Derek, which was unusual. Her voice was measured, even gentle. She said they had been thinking and they wanted to reset the conversation. She said she hoped I knew they loved me, that this was just about practical realities, and that she thought if we sat down together without attorneys or letters in between us, we might find a solution that worked for everyone. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to all 3 messages back to back. Then I deleted them, not out of anger, out of clarity. I had heard the same speech before, restructured 3 different ways. The architecture was always identical. Soften the approach, reframe the demand as mutual benefit, suggest that my resistance was the problem rather than their original action. It was the kind of persuasion that works on people who have not yet decided what they want. I had decided. The following Monday, something else arrived. A card, in a pale blue envelope, handwritten. Inside, a gift card to my favorite garden supply store, the one on Route 40, where I bought my bulbs every fall, and a note in Tiffany's handwriting that read, "No pressure, no agenda. Just thinking of you. D&T. $50 toward petunias as the price of my home. I put the gift card in a drawer. I did not use it. I did not throw it away. I kept it because it was documentation of an attempt to influence me while legal proceedings were in motion. Carol thought I was being overly cautious. Bill Henderson, when I told him, said, "Keep everything." I kept everything. What I noticed in the days that followed was that the calls and messages had stopped. Derek and Tiffany had shifted from pressure to surveillance. I could feel it, not literally, but in the way that people who know you begin to move differently around you when they're waiting for something. Derek's social media, which I still checked occasionally and against my better judgment, showed him and Tiffany at a restaurant, then at a weekend trip, performing normalcy with the particular effort of people who are managing an audience. Tiffany posted a picture of a beautifully arranged kitchen counter, neutral tones, clean lines, with a caption about creating the life you want. The life she wanted appeared to involve my house. I found my support, as it often happens, not in one dramatic gesture, but in the accumulation of ordinary people who gave me ordinary things at the right time. Sandra called every other day from Cincinnati. She had 3 grown children of her own and no illusions about family dynamics. "You are not doing anything wrong," she told me in her flat, practical way one Tuesday morning while I was deadheading roses. "You are protecting what is yours. Anyone who tells you that makes you selfish is trying to take something from you." My neighbor Ruth, who was 74 and had outlived 2 husbands and 1 son, came over for tea one afternoon, and I told her more than I intended to. She listened, and then she said something I wrote in my notebook afterward. "The cruelest thing a child can do to a parent is make them feel that their love was the vehicle for the betrayal." I sat with that for a long time. At my garden club, I said nothing specific. I am not a woman who broadcasts her troubles. But Linda Marsh, who had navigated her own complicated estate situation several years prior, mentioned, unprompted, the name of a trust litigation specialist in Columbus. "Just in case," she said. "You never know." I wrote the name down. I also did something I had been considering since Carol first asked about my mail. I installed new locks. Not dramatically. I called a locksmith, had the deadbolts changed on both exterior doors and the sliding door to the back patio, and collected the new keys myself. I also went through the house methodically and secured anything of documentary value. The trust documents themselves. Bill had the originals, the folder of financial records, the small fireproof box in the bedroom closet that held my passport and Frank's death certificate, and the deed to my cemetery plot. I was not being paranoid. I was being thorough. And in the evenings, I sat on my porch in the April dusk and watched the light change over the old oak in the backyard, and I thought about Frank, and I thought about what he would have made of all this. He would have been heartbroken, I think. He had loved Derek in that uncomplicated, wholehearted way that some fathers manage. But he also had a hard streak of justice in him. He would not have been surprised by Tiffany. He had met women like her before, and he had always known them for what they were within minutes. "Some people walk into a room and count what's in it," he told me once. "Others walk in and see who's in it. You can tell a lot about a person by which they do first." I thought about Tiffany standing in my dining room doorway, her eyes moving over the walls. I thought about what was coming, and I was ready. They came on a Sunday, 2 weeks after the gift card, and this time Derek had called ahead, which should have been reassuring, but wasn't. He called on Saturday evening, his voice carefully modulated, and said they wanted to take me to brunch. His treat. "Somewhere nice," he said. The new place on Jefferson, the one that had opened last fall. He had made a reservation. He asked if 11 o'clock worked. I said it did. I also called Carol that night and told her. Don't go to their turf, Carol said immediately. Meet somewhere neutral or at your house. I thought about it. Then I said, my house. I'll make coffee. I want this to happen on ground I control. I called Derek back and told him that brunch out wasn't convenient, but they were welcome to come for coffee at 10. There was a pause, brief, calculating, and then he agreed. They arrived at 10:02. Tiffany carried a box of pastries from the Good Bakery downtown, which meant she had planned this before Derek called me. She presented them with a smile that was warm in the way that stage lighting is warm, technically correct, generating no actual heat. We sat in the living room. I had not set up the kitchen table. The living room was more formal, and I wanted formal. I poured coffee from the carafe I had prepared, and I let them arrange themselves on the sofa while I took Frank's chair. The chair was a small choice, but it was not an accident. Derek began with 5 minutes of what I could only call atmospheric preparation. How nice the house looked, how good my garden was coming along, how much they had missed spending time with me. Tiffany nodded at intervals and offered soft, corroborating sounds. It was a practiced performance, and it would have worked on someone who needed to be reassured that they were loved. I did not need that. I waited. The turn came when Derek set down his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly, and I recognized the posture. He used to do the same thing as a boy when he was about to negotiate. Mom, he said, we want to apologize for how this started. The text was, it was too abrupt. We know that, and we're sorry. Thank you, I said. He looked slightly wrong-footed by the brevity of my response. He had expected more. Relief, softening, the opening he needed. He pressed on. But the underlying situation is real, he said. We're stretched financially. Tiffany and I have obligations, the mortgage on the condo, her mother's medical costs, some business debts I haven't talked about. We're not asking you to be homeless, Mom. We would never ask that. He paused. There are options. We've looked into senior living communities. Derek, I said. I'm going to stop you there. He stopped. I know what this conversation is, I said, and I appreciate that you've delivered it more carefully than a text message. But the answer to the underlying question is no. The house is not available to you. Not now. Not as a sale. Not as any arrangement that requires me to leave it. Tiffany shifted. Her voice came in smoothly, rehearsed. Maggie, we're not asking you to see it as a loss. We're asking you to see it as an evolution. You've spent so much of your life maintaining this place alone. Wouldn't it be freeing to... Freeing, I repeated. She caught something in the word and hesitated. Tiffany, I said, very calmly. You mentioned when you were last here that you knew about the inheritance from Eleanor Calloway's estate. I'd like to know how you know that. The room went quiet. Tiffany's eyes moved to Derek. It was a fast look, almost involuntary, and in a court of law it would have meant nothing. But in a living room, between people who know each other, it meant everything. Derek said, I think you mentioned it at some point. Years ago. I didn't, I said. I've never discussed Eleanor's estate with you. It wasn't relevant to you. It passed privately. Mom, that's not... I also want to know, I continued, keeping my voice even, what else you may have found when you were in my study last summer. The silence was of a different quality now. Tiffany's posture had changed, the practiced openness tightening into something angular and alert. Derek's jaw had shifted in the way that meant he was recalculating. You went through my files, I said. It was not a question. I was looking for the insurance documents, Derek said. For the car. You asked me to... The car insurance is in the glove compartment, I said. It has been in the glove compartment for 30 years. He had no answer to that. Tiffany leaned forward. The warm, lighting smile was gone entirely now. Maggie, I want to be honest with you. And then she said something that removed any remaining ambiguity about the nature of this visit. You are 78, 68, 68 years old. You are living alone. You are one fall, one diagnosis, one crisis away from needing full-time care. We are trying to help you plan for that reality before it becomes an emergency. If you refuse to be reasonable, we will have no choice but to look into whether a competency evaluation might be appropriate. The room was very still. I sat with it for a moment. A competency evaluation. The implication being that a woman who refused to hand over her home was, by definition, not fully in possession of her faculties. I felt something cold move through me. And yes, I will be honest, I felt afraid. Not of the evaluation itself, which had no basis and would go nowhere, but of the willingness to say it. Of the distance my son and his wife had traveled to reach the point where that sentence could be spoken in my living room, over good coffee and bakery pastries on a Sunday morning. I think you should leave, I said. Derek stood. Mom, I'd like you to leave now, I said. And I'd like you to know that this conversation has been noted, the date, and the substance of it, and my attorney will be informed. Tiffany stood, smoothing her blazer, her expression reassembling itself into something cool and final. We're only trying to help, she said. I know what you're trying to do, I said. They left. I sat in Frank's chair for a very long time after the sound of their car faded from the driveway. The fear was real, and I let myself feel it. Because denying it would have been foolish, and I was not a foolish woman. They had shown me their bottom card. They were willing to question my competency, which meant they were either desperate or genuinely believed it would work. But fear, I have learned, can be fuel. I picked up my phone. I called Bill Henderson's cell. I told him about the competency remark. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's harassment, Maggie. That's actionable. I know, I said. Good, he said. Then let's make sure it counts for something. The meeting took place on a Thursday morning in May in Bill Henderson's conference room on the second floor of his Main Street building. It had been Bill's idea, and I had agreed without hesitation. He called Derek directly, not through me, and informed him that there were matters relating to the Calloway estate that required Derek's presence, that it was in his interest to attend, and that he was welcome to bring his own attorney if he chose to. Derek arrived with a man named Philip Kwan, a general practice lawyer from a firm in Columbus, young and reasonably confident in the way of people who haven't yet been in a room where they were entirely outmatched. Tiffany came too, though she had not been specifically invited. She sat beside Derek in one of Bill's gray upholstered chairs and arranged herself as his support and advisor, her hands folded on the table over a yellow legal pad on which she had apparently prepared notes. I arrived first. I wore the blue dress I had worn to Frank's funeral. Not as a statement, but because it was the most composed thing I owned, and composure was what I wanted to carry into that room. Bill opened the meeting without preamble. He was like that. He laid a folder on the table and began. First, the trust documents. He went through the legal structure clearly and methodically. The creation in 2003, the amendment in 2011, the recorded status with the county, the explicit language prohibiting any transfer, sale, or encumbrance during the trustee's lifetime without notarized trustee consent. Philip Kwan read along. His expression, as he read, shifted from polite attention to something quieter. Derek said, I didn't know about this trust. That's apparent, Bill said. However, Not knowing about it doesn't alter its legal force. Then Bill opened a second folder. This one contained the cease and desist letter and its delivery confirmation. The documented contact with Stacy Vollmer of Vollmer Realty. Stacy had, when contacted by Bill's office, provided a written account of her exchanges with Derek, in which Derek had represented himself as having authority to list the property. That representation, Bill explained, constituted fraud regardless of whether a sale was ever completed. Philip Kwan made a small sound. He leaned toward Derek and said something in a low voice. Derek stared at the table. Then Bill produced the photocopy, the copy of the 1987 purchase agreement that I had found in my filing cabinet. He explained when and where I had found it and what its presence implied. He noted that entering a private residence and removing or copying private documents without consent was, depending on interpretation, a violation of privacy statutes. Tiffany's legal pad remained unopened. This is circumstantial, Philip Kwan said carefully. A photocopy in a filing cabinet could have been there for any number of reasons. It could, Bill agreed pleasantly, which is why I obtained a statement from Ms. Vollmer regarding the representations Derek made about his legal authority, which is decidedly not circumstantial. He paused. I also have a written record of a statement made to my client, Mrs. Calloway, during a visit on the 12th of this month, in which Mrs. Derek Calloway suggested that a competency evaluation might be sought if Mrs. Calloway refused to comply with their requests. Philip Kwan put down his pen. He turned to Derek. Did you make that representation? Derek looked at Tiffany. It was that look again. The same involuntary look I had seen in my living room, fast and helpless and utterly legible. He was looking at her because it had been her idea. Anyone in the room could read it. Tiffany's composure held for about 4 more seconds. Then she said, "We were concerned for her welfare. That's all that was." Using the threat of a competency proceeding to coerce an elderly homeowner into vacating a property, Bill said, is elder financial abuse under Ohio law. That is not a civil matter. That is criminal exposure. The room went very still. Derek said, "That's not... We weren't..." "Derek," Philip Kwan said quietly. "Stop talking." It was at that moment, I think, that Derek understood the situation completely. I watched it happen. His face went through 3 or 4 things in quick succession. Argument, indignation, calculation, and then, at the bottom of all of them, something that might have been recognition. The plan had not been a plan. It had been a fantasy built on an incomplete document and the assumption that his mother was manageable. I had not been manageable. I had been waiting. Tiffany, across the table, was not finished. "I will give her this." She was tenacious. She said, in a voice from which all the warmth had been stripped, "You could still be reasonable about this. You could still choose to..." "Tiffany," I said. She stopped. I had not spoken since we sat down. It was the first time I'd said her name in the room, and I said it quietly, with no particular force, which is sometimes more arresting than volume. "I want you to hear me clearly," I said. "This house was built by 2 people who worked for 40 years to have it. My husband is buried 10 miles from here. I have lived in this house for 37 years. I will continue to live in it. I will not be frightened out of it, and I will not be manipulated out of it, and I will not be legally maneuvered out of it, because the law is not on your side. It is entirely and without exception on mine." I looked at Derek. "You are my son," I said. "I love you in the way that doesn't go away regardless of what you do. But what you did, both of you, was not a misunderstanding or a financial stress response or a communication failure. It was a choice, and choices have consequences." Philip Kwan was writing rapidly. Derek said nothing. For the first time in this entire episode, he had nothing to say. Bill placed one final document on the table. Mrs. Calloway has no interest in criminal prosecution at this time, he said. What she requires is a signed acknowledgement from both of you that you have no claim, legal or equitable, on the property at 412 Clover Street during Mrs. Calloway's lifetime. She further requires a signed commitment that neither of you will initiate any competency or guardianship proceedings against her without a documented medical recommendation from her own physician. Philip Kwan looked at the documents. Then he looked at his client. Derek signed. Tiffany, after a long pause, signed. I watched them sign, and I felt nothing dramatic. No triumph, no grief, no catharsis. Just the particular quiet of a thing being made permanent. I picked up my copy of the agreement, folded it in thirds, the same way a document looks when it's been carried somewhere carefully, and put it in my purse. Then I thanked Bill, stood, and walked out into the May morning without looking back. The day after the meeting, I planted dahlias along the back fence. Frank had always liked dahlias, thought they looked serious, which was his highest compliment for flowers. I dug the holes in the good morning dirt, feeling the soil give under my hands, and I thought about consequences. About how long they take to arrive, and how completely they arrive when they finally do. The consequences in the weeks that followed were administrative and irrevocable, which is the most complete kind. Bill Henderson filed the formal record of the signed agreement with the county. It was attached to the property file, a permanent, searchable document establishing that Derek Calloway had no legal standing regarding the property at 412 Clover Street during his mother's lifetime. Any future challenge would face not only the trust structure, but this signed acknowledgement, in Derek's own hand, obtained in the presence of his own attorney. Stacy Vollmer's brokerage sent a formal written apology to Bill's office. She had not known the property was in trust and had acted in good faith on Derek's fraudulent representations. Bill was measured in his response. No further action, provided the matter was fully closed. It was closed. 3 weeks later, Bill called. "Maggie," he said, "Derek may be facing some scrutiny regarding his business debts. It appears he represented a property to a private lender as incoming inheritance, timeline, flexible." I was quiet for a moment. "He borrowed against my house." "Apparently so. I wanted you to know in case you were contacted. Any communication should come through me." I thanked him and hung up. I sat on the porch that evening and thought about that for a long time. Derek had not just sent an angry text one Thursday morning. He had told a lender a lie he may have half believed himself, had built a financial structure on a foundation that had never existed, because the alternative was that he had known it was a lie from the beginning, which was a different and darker thing entirely. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired and sad and clear. The sadness was for the boy who had slept under glow-in-the-dark stars, who had cried at his father's funeral with his whole body the way children do even when they're grown. That boy had been real. This man was also real. Both of them were my son. But I had not created the situation. I had only refused to lose because of it. Carol came for dinner that Friday, and we sat on the porch with wine as the neighborhood settled into evening, the street going quiet in the particular way it does in late spring when the light holds longer than you expect. "So it's done?" she asked. "The legal part is done," I said. "The rest will take longer. It always does." She nodded, looking out at the yard. "And the house?" I looked at the old oak at the back, the fresh-turned soil along the fence, where the dahlias were just beginning to settle in. "The house is mine," I said. "It always was." She raised her glass. I raised mine. "To Frank," I said. "To Frank," she agreed. What Derek and Tiffany had miscalculated was not the legal structure. They could be forgiven, in theory, for not knowing about the trust. What they had miscalculated was the person. They had looked at a 68-year-old woman living alone in a 4-bedroom house and seen something that could be moved, something that could be pressured or frightened or worn down into yielding. They had not seen what Frank had seen when he met me at 26. They had not seen what my father had passed to me without ever naming it. They had not seen what I was made of. They knew now. I said goodnight to Carol, went inside, locked the new deadbolt, washed my glass and turned off the kitchen light. And I went to bed in my house on Clover Street, where I had always lived and where I intended to stay. By summer, the dahlias had opened. They came in deep red and amber, serious colors, Frank's colors. And they lined the back fence in a way that made the yard look intentional, cared for, permanently inhabited. I photographed them one morning in the low early light and had the print framed. It hung in the kitchen next to the window where I could see it while I made coffee. My life in the months after had a quality I can only describe as spaciousness. I joined a twice-weekly watercolor class at the community center, something I had deferred for years. I was terrible for the first month, adequate for the second, and by fall, I had painted the oak in my backyard and given it to Sandra in Cincinnati, who hung it in her hallway. I also joined the local Historical Preservation Society. My house, a 1952 colonial in original condition, was of genuine interest to their catalog project. It gave me something unexpected, the sense that the house was part of something larger than my own life. Carol and I kept our Friday dinners. She was and remains one of the steady things. I saw Derek once in September. We met at a diner on Route 40. Nothing special. He came alone. He told me the lender situation had been resolved at significant cost. He had liquidated his investment accounts and was carrying the consequences without Tiffany's help because Tiffany had left in August. She had left when it became clear that the plan had failed. Not that the marriage had died for complicated reasons. The plan had failed, and she had gone. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the text, for what happened in your house, for all of it." It was not a complete apology, but I know my son's voice, and I know when he means something. "I hear you," I said. We did not hug, but he held the door for me, and when I drove home, the weight was not heavier than when I had left. As for Tiffany, she had moved to Columbus and taken a position at a property management company, new rooms to assess. I hoped, without malice, that she would eventually find something she valued that couldn't be sold. On a Tuesday evening in November, I sat on the porch with tea as the last light left the sky. The dahlias had gone in for the season, cut back and waiting. The street was quiet. I thought about what it means to stay, not from inertia, but as an act. To plant something, to hang a photograph, to be in a place so completely that it becomes part of the evidence of who you are. I brought my cup inside. I turned on the porch light. Same fixture, same yellow circle on the same front steps. Continuous since Frank installed it in 1991. The house held me, as it always had, and I held it back. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs it. My husband secretly transferred our home into his name and sold it for $1.5 million. The new owners were already standing at the door with the keys. I smiled, let them in, and immediately called my lawyer. What happened next? Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. The house on Clover Hill Road had been mine long before it was ours. I want you to understand that from the very beginning, because it matters. It matters more than I realized for most of my marriage. My father built that house in 1961, poured the foundation with his own hands on a Saturday in October, And I grew up watching the oak tree in the backyard grow from a sapling into something you could lean against and feel the whole weight of the world ease off your shoulders. When my parents passed, they left the house to me, not to us. To me, Margaret Ann Arlo, née Whitfield. I was 51 years old, and I thought that detail, my name on the deed, was just a formality, the kind of paperwork nobody thinks about until they have to. Dennis and I had been married for 31 years by then. We weren't a romantic story, not the kind you'd tell at a dinner party. We were practical, steady. He sold commercial insurance. I had retired from teaching 4th grade, and we spent our evenings watching the news and arguing pleasantly about whether the tomatoes needed more water. I cooked Sunday roasts. He fixed the gutters in the fall. We were, as far as I understood the word, fine. The first sign came in March, about 14 months before everything fell apart. Dennis started taking phone calls in the garage. Now, I am not a paranoid woman. I have never gone through a man's pockets or checked his phone. That has never been my nature. But Dennis had always been a loud talker. You could hear him from 2 rooms away, the kind of voice that filled a space whether you wanted it to or not. And suddenly, he was taking his coffee out to the garage and closing the door. And when he came back in, his expression had that careful blankness that I recognized from 30 years of marriage as the face he wore when he didn't want me to ask questions. I didn't ask, not then. In April, he suggested we take a trip to Florida. Dennis hated Florida. He had always called it God's waiting room, with the particular contempt of a man who refused to acknowledge that he was 66 years old. But there he was, cheerful in a way that felt rehearsed, spreading a travel brochure across the kitchen table and suggesting Clearwater Beach. I went along with it. We spent a week in a rental condo, and he was distant and pleasant, like a man performing the role of husband for an audience I couldn't see. When we came home, I noticed a file folder on his desk that he moved quickly when I walked into the study. That was when the cold feeling started. Not panic, not accusation, just a low, steady chill. The way a house feels when a window has been left open somewhere, and you can't find which one. By June, I had started paying closer attention. I noticed he'd asked me, twice, in casual conversation, whether I still had the original deed documents from when my parents' estate was settled. I told him I kept everything in the fireproof box in the bedroom closet. He nodded and didn't bring it up again. I didn't think much of it at the time. Later, I would understand exactly why he was asking. I also noticed he had started spending time with a woman from his office, Kristen Daly. I had met her once at a company Christmas party. Mid-40s, careful smile, the kind of woman who always seems to be evaluating the room. He mentioned her name a few times in passing, said she was handling a big account with him. I filed that information in the back of my mind the way you file things you're not ready to look at directly. The summer passed. The oak tree in the backyard turned gold. I made apple butter and called my daughter Claire in Portland every Sunday and told her everything was fine because I believed it mostly was. And because what would I even say? And then came that Tuesday in September. I had been at my book club, Doris Hartley's house on Maple Street. We were reading Olive Kitteridge for the second time and arguing about whether Olive was sympathetic. And I came home at 3:30 to find an unfamiliar silver SUV parked in my driveway. A couple stood on my porch, late 30s, well-dressed, the woman holding a set of keys on a plain metal ring. The man had a folder tucked under his arm. They looked at me with an expression I did not immediately understand, a mixture of recognition and discomfort. "Mrs. Harlow?" the woman said. "We were told the house would be vacant." I looked at the keys in her hand. I looked at the folder under his arm. And somewhere in the center of my chest, something that had been quietly tightening for months finally pulled completely taut. I smiled. I cannot fully explain why I smiled. Instinct, perhaps, or the 40 years of practice that comes from managing a classroom full of 9-year-olds who are all lying to you simultaneously. I smiled and I said, "Oh, of course, please come in." And I stepped aside and held the door open. And the moment they walked past me into my living room, I reached into my purse and called Franklin Greer. Franklin was my attorney. He had handled my parents' estate. He had known me for 22 years. He picked up on the second ring. "Franklin," I said quietly, stepping into the kitchen while the couple stood uncertainly in my hallway. "I need you to tell me right now whether anyone has legally transferred the deed to my house." There was a silence on the line that told me everything before he said a single word. Franklin's pause lasted exactly 4 seconds. I counted them. "Margaret," he said, and he never called me Margaret unless something was serious. "I need you to stay calm and not say anything definitive to whoever is in that house with you right now." So it was true. I had known it the moment I saw those keys, but knowing something and having an attorney confirm it are two entirely different experiences. Knowing is a feeling. Confirmation is the floor dropping out from under you. "I understand," I said, in the same even voice I had once used to tell a classroom of children that yes, there was a fire drill, and no, they did not need to panic. I walked back into the hallway. The couple, they told me later their names were Ryan and Melissa Cook, and I want to be clear that they were not villains in this story. They were buyers who had been deceived just as I had. Were standing near the staircase, visibly uncomfortable. The woman still had those keys in her hand, a house key, my house key, cut from a copy that someone had made without my knowledge. "I'm so sorry," I said pleasantly. "There seems to have been a miscommunication about the timeline. Could I ask you to give me 24 hours? I just need to confirm a few details with my husband." I kept the smile absolutely steady. "I'm sure we can get this sorted out." They exchanged a glance. The husband, Ryan, started to say something about a closing date and a moving truck already booked, and I listened to all of it with great attention and nodded in exactly the right places. And then I walked them back to the door and watched their silver SUV back out of my driveway. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and I let myself have 10 minutes. I want to be honest with you about those 10 minutes, because I think people sometimes expect the wronged party in a story like this to be immediately fierce, immediately strategic. I was not. I sat in the kitchen of the house my father had built, at the table where I had fed my children breakfast for 20 years, and I was afraid. Genuinely, physically afraid. The kind of fear that sits in your stomach and makes you feel like you're 80 years old and very small. 31 years of marriage, 31 years of someone's name next to yours on Christmas cards and joint tax returns and the shared shorthand of a life built together. And it had been used against me like a tool. I let myself have those 10 minutes. Then I stood up and washed my face at the kitchen sink. Here is what I knew, sitting at that table before I made another call. Dennis had somehow transferred the deed to my house, inherited from my parents, with my name on the original title, into his name alone, and had then sold it to the Cook family for a sum I would later learn was $1.5 million. He had arranged a closing. He had handed over keys. He had done all of this while I attended book club and made apple butter and called our daughter every Sunday. The questions came fast and cold. Had he forged my signature? Had he found a way through the estate documents? Where was the money? Was it already gone? Was Kristen Daly involved? And underneath all of those questions, the one I kept flinching from, how long had he been planning this? I called Franklin back. The next 40 minutes were the most clarifying of my adult life. Franklin spoke carefully and precisely, the way he always does, and what he told me was this. A deed transfer had been recorded at the county recorder's office 11 weeks earlier. The signature on the transfer document carried my name. I had not signed any such document, which meant one of two things. Either the signature was forged, or I had been manipulated into signing something I didn't understand, possibly buried in a stack of other paperwork. Franklin said the second scenario was more common than most people believed. "What are my options?" I asked. "Your options are significant," he said, "but you need to act carefully and you need to act soon." We agreed to meet the following morning at 9. Before we hung up, Franklin told me one more thing. Under Oregon law, we were in Clover Hill, a suburb of Portland. A marital home required both spouses' consent for sale, regardless of how title was held, if it qualified as the primary residence. There were grounds, potentially strong grounds, to challenge the transfer as fraudulent and to seek an injunction against the sale proceeding. "He may not know that you know yet," Franklin said. "He doesn't," I said. "Then don't tell him tonight." Dennis came home at 6:15, the same time he had come home for 30 years. He smelled like the same aftershave. He asked what was for dinner. He hung his keys on the hook by the door. Not my house keys, I noticed, his car keys. And I made spaghetti. And we sat across from each other at the same kitchen table where I had spent 10 minutes being afraid, and I listened to him talk about a golf game he was planning with someone from the office, and I said, and that sounds nice, and I did not say a single true thing for the entire meal. Watching him that night, the ease of him, the comfort, I felt the fear convert into something else, something quieter and colder and considerably more useful. I had been a teacher for 37 years. I knew how to be patient. I knew how to watch a situation develop and choose exactly the right moment to act. And I knew, with a clarity that surprised me with its force, that I was not going to let Dennis Harlow take my father's house. Before I went to sleep that night, I wrote 3 things in the small notebook I kept in my nightstand: the money, the signature, the woman. Those were the 3 threads I needed to pull. I also wrote a 4th line, which I underlined twice. Do not let him know you know. That was my plan in its earliest form. Crude, yes. But sometimes the most important strategic decision you make is simply to keep your face completely still. I was in Franklin's office at 8:55 the next morning. His office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, the kind of place with dark wood paneling and the particular smell of old case files. And I had been there enough times over the years that his receptionist, a young woman named Becca, just waved me through without buzzing. I sat across from Franklin's desk in the same chair I'd sat in when we'd settled my mother's estate, and I put the fireproof box on the desk between us. I had retrieved it from the bedroom closet at 5:30 that morning while Dennis slept. I had been very quiet. Inside the box were the original property deed from 1961 in my father's name, the probate documents from when the house transferred to me after my parents passed, my own name on every line, and every property tax notice we had received for the subsequent 17 years, all addressed to Margaret A. Harlow. I also brought every piece of paper I could find that bore my signature. Bank documents, insurance forms, a letter to our homeowners association from 2 years ago. Franklin spread them across his desk and studied them for a long time without speaking. "I'm going to refer you to someone," he said, "a forensic document examiner. Her name is Dr. Patricia Voss. She works out of a firm in Beaverton, and she has testified as an expert witness in 17 fraud cases in this state. I want her to look at the signature on the transfer deed." "How quickly can she do it?" "For something like this, I'll call her this morning. Probably 3 to 4 days for a preliminary assessment. 3 to 4 days. I thought about the Cook family and their moving truck. What about the sale? I asked. If they have a closing date, I filed for a temporary restraining order this morning at 7 a.m., Franklin said. The transfer of title is frozen pending investigation. The Cook family's attorney has already been notified. I sat very still for a moment. You filed before I even arrived. I filed the moment you called me yesterday, he said. He said it simply, without drama, and I was grateful for that. Margaret, what he did, if the signature is forged, and I believe it is not just a civil matter. This is deed fraud. It's a felony in this state. I had known that was coming. I had known it intellectually since the night before. But hearing it said plainly in a wood-paneled office at 9 in the morning, with my father's 1961 deed lying on the desk between us, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. I drove home along the river. The water was gray-green and very still. I kept both hands on the wheel. Dennis was still home when I got back. He usually left for the office by 9, but his car was still in the driveway, which was unusual enough to make my pulse quicken slightly. I found him in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee, and there was something off about his posture. A kind of alertness that wasn't his normal morning looseness. "Where were you?" he asked. Casual, but his eyes weren't casual. "Grocery run," I said, and held up the small bag I'd had the presence of mind to stop for on the way home. Milk, bread, a box of chamomile tea. We were out of milk. He looked at the bag. He looked at me. I have no idea whether he noticed the fireproof box was gone from the closet. He would have had to look specifically for it to know, and I had replaced it with a similarly sized box of old tax returns. But something was operating behind his eyes that morning that told me the comfortable weeks of his unawareness were ending. I made breakfast. I did not shake. 4 days later, Dr. Patricia Voss sent her preliminary report to Franklin. I read it sitting in Franklin's office again, this time with a cup of tea that had gone cold in my hands. The report was 19 pages. The summary was 3 paragraphs. The most important sentence was in the second paragraph, and I read it twice. The questioned signature on document A, warranty deed transfer, recorded date, exhibits significant variation from the known exemplars in letter formation, pen pressure, and baseline alignment, inconsistent with normal variation, and is consistent with simulation by a person other than the purported signer. Forged. My signature had been forged on a legal document to steal my house. I put the paper down on Franklin's desk and looked out his window at the traffic below and thought about the woman named Kristen Daly and whether she had known and how long it had been planned and at what specific point in our 31-year marriage my husband had looked at me and decided I was an obstacle rather than a person. "There's something else," Franklin said. He turned his computer screen toward me. He had pulled the county property records, following the money the way you follow a river to its source. The sale price was listed, $1,500,000. The wire transfer had gone to a joint account, not our joint account, a new one, opened 6 months ago at a bank I'd never heard of, in the names of Dennis R. Harlow and Kristen Ann Daly. There it was, all 3 threads in one document. I thought about the 10 minutes I had spent being afraid at my kitchen table. I thought about my father driving fence posts into the earth on a cold October morning in 1961. I thought about every Sunday I had spent making the roast and not asking questions. "What do we do next?" I asked. Franklin had already printed the filing forms. This was the point, I realized. Sitting in that chair with forged paper and a fraudulent bank account on the desk in front of me, from which there was no returning to anything that had been before. Not to the spaghetti dinners. Not to the comfortable silences. not to the version of my life in which I had been the woman who did not ask questions. I picked up a pen and I started signing my actual, real, unforged name. The restraining order hit Dennis like a cold bucket of water, and I know this because I was home when he got the call. It was a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after my second meeting with Franklin. I was in the garden. I had been spending more time in the garden that week, finding that physical work was the only reliable way to keep my hands from trembling. When I heard Dennis's voice through the kitchen window rise in a way it almost never did, a sudden, sharp elevation, the voice of a man who has just stepped on something unexpected in the dark. I stayed in the garden. I deadheaded the roses very slowly and listened. By the time he came outside, he had composed himself into something that was almost his normal face. Almost. There was a tightness around his jaw that I recognized from 31 years as the specific look of a man who is recalculating. Margaret. He almost never called me Margaret. Dennis, I said and clipped a stem. I need to talk to you about the house. Which house? I asked pleasantly. The recalculation behind his eyes went into overdrive. He had expected, I think, either tears or ignorance. He had not expected pleasantness. He had not considered, in whatever plan he had assembled with Kristen Daly, that the woman who had spent 37 years managing the emotional temperature of classrooms full of 9-year-olds might be somewhat more difficult to destabilize than he'd assumed. Franklin Greer filed something, he said. Did he? I put down my clippers and looked at him directly, perhaps for the first time in months. That must have been surprising for you. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he went back inside. That evening, Kristen Daly called my cell phone. I did not know she had my number. I found out later Dennis had given it to her, apparently because they had expected to need to negotiate. And hearing her voice, composed and almost sympathetic, was one of the more surreal experiences of that period. She said she wanted to explain. She said there had been a misunderstanding. She said that Dennis had told her the house was solely in his name, and she had no reason to believe otherwise. I let her finish. Kristen, I said, my attorney will be in touch with yours. Margaret, if this goes to court, then it goes to court, I said, and ended the call. 2 days later, they came to the house together. I want to be precise about this moment because it revealed something important about both of them. They came together, which told me that individually they were afraid of what I might say or do, and that they needed the psychological reinforcement of each other. Dennis rang the bell as though he didn't have a key, which by that point he didn't, because I had changed the locks the morning after my second meeting with Franklin, a detail that clearly startled him when I opened the door and he instinctively reached for his pocket. Kristen was polished. She was calm, and she stood at a slight angle to Dennis in a way that positioned her as the rational party, in contrast to the potential chaos she expected from me. She was perhaps 44 or 45. She had the careful poise of a woman who has learned to manage difficult conversations professionally, and for a moment I understood why Dennis had found her compelling. She projected capability. We'd like to come in, Dennis said. I considered this for exactly 2 seconds. Then I stepped aside. They sat at my kitchen table. I noticed Dennis's eyes move to the fireproof box's usual spot on the shelf, which was now empty. And Kristen spoke first. She had clearly prepared. The core of what she said was this: that pursuing legal action would be costly, prolonged, and damaging to everyone, including my daughter Claire, whose name she mentioned in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. She said that a private settlement could be arranged quickly. She implied, without stating directly, that my willingness to litigate would be portrayed as a vindictive older woman attempting to sabotage her husband's retirement finances. I looked at her while she talked. I looked at Dennis, who was not meeting my eyes. Let me make sure I understand, I said when she finished. You're suggesting that I accept a private payment, relinquish any legal claim to my father's house, and in exchange, you'll refrain from telling people I'm being vindictive. I wouldn't put it that way. I would, I said, and my answer is no. Dennis finally looked at me. Peggy, if this goes criminal, deed fraud is a felony, Dennis. It was a felony when you committed it. The temperature in the kitchen changed. Kristen's composure slipped for just a moment, a tightening around the eyes that she covered quickly, and Dennis went very still in the way that men go still when they realize they have significantly miscalculated the nature of the person they've been living with. They left 20 minutes later. No settlement, no agreement. Nothing resolved except the question of whether I could be pressured, which had been answered definitively. I closed the door and stood in my hallway for a moment. My heart was beating faster than I would have liked. I was 68 years old, and I had just told my husband of 31 years and his mistress in my own kitchen that I intended to bring a felony case against them, and the reality of what that meant. The months ahead, the courtroom, the public nature of it all, settled on me like a weight. I called my daughter Claire that evening, not the Sunday call, a real call. She arrived from Portland the following Friday. I took those 4 days for myself. I sat in the garden in the mornings. I read. I did not answer emails about the case. I let Franklin handle the correspondence, and I let myself be still for a short stretch before the real work began, because I had learned in 37 years of teaching that the people who last longest in a fight are not the ones who burn brightest at the start, but the ones who know when to rest. Claire arrived on a Friday evening with a bag large enough for 2 weeks and an expression I had last seen on her face when she was 9 years old, and had decided to personally hold accountable a boy in her class who had stolen her library book. My daughter is 43, a structural engineer, and she has my father's jaw and my mother's determination and very little patience for dishonesty in any of its forms. She sat at the kitchen table while I made tea, and I told her everything from the beginning. I told her about the garage phone calls, about Florida, about the file folder he'd moved, about the Cook family on the porch with keys cut from locks I hadn't changed, about Kristen Daly's phone call and the joint bank account bearing both their names and the $1.5 million that had passed through it. I told her about the forged signature, reading her the relevant line from Dr. Voss's report from memory, the words simulation by a person other than the purported signer falling into the kitchen with the particular weight of professional confirmation. Claire held her tea and did not speak until I had finished. Then she said, "Mom, where is he now?" "He checked into the Residence Inn on Burnside 3 days ago," I said. "I changed the locks." She nodded slowly. "Good. Then, what do you need from me?" That question. I had been holding myself together for 2 weeks, largely on forward motion, and the avoidance of stopping long enough to ask that question of myself. What did I need? I needed someone to sit across from me at this table who was not performing, who was not calculating, who was simply there. I had forgotten, in the strange sealed world of the previous 2 weeks, what it felt like to have someone simply be on your side without conditions. "I need you to stay for a while," I said. "Obviously," Claire said and refilled my tea. The following week was, in its way, the quietest of that entire period. Dennis and Kristen had retreated, not out of surrender, I understood, but out of strategy. They were consulting with their own attorney, a man named Howard Bloom, whose name Franklin mentioned with a very slight pause that conveyed a library of professional opinion. They were preparing their own narrative. I knew this. Franklin knew this, but the immediate noise had stopped, and in the quiet, I could hear myself think again. I want to tell you about something that happened on the Wednesday of that week, because it mattered more than it might sound. My friend Doris Hartley, from the book club, the one whose house I'd been at the evening this all began, came by with a casserole. Doris is 71 and has lived 3 doors down from me for 22 years. And she is the kind of woman who processes information slowly and then acts on it with great solidity. She sat in my living room while Claire was out, and she said, "Peggy, I need you to know that everyone on this street knows what he did, and not one person is neutral." I hadn't expected that. I hadn't told anyone except Claire, Franklin, and my sister in Ohio. But Clover Hill was a neighborhood in the old sense. People noticed when a strange car was in a driveway, when a woman walked her garden with a tighter jaw than usual, when a man suddenly stopped being seen carrying in groceries on Saturday mornings. People talked. And in this case, they had talked in my favor. "They'll say things," Doris said. "In court or wherever, people who've seen him come and go. Neighbors who had appraisers walking through without anyone explaining why. I kept a note last spring when a man with a clipboard was photographing your house from the sidewalk. I didn't know what it meant then. A man with a clipboard photographing my house. That photograph would later appear in Dennis's records as part of the property appraisal documentation. Doris's note of the date placed it 6 weeks before the fraudulent deed transfer. I wrote down the date she gave me and called Franklin the next morning. Meanwhile, Dennis and Kristen apparently decided that patience was their best weapon. According to what Franklin heard through proper legal channels, their defense was taking shape around 2 arguments. First, that I had been aware of and had verbally consented to the sale as part of an informal marital agreement. And second, that the signature on the deed was not forged, but was the result of my signing a document I had been confused about. That second argument, confused elderly woman didn't understand what she was signing, was the one that made Claire's jaw go hard when I told her. "They're going to try to make you seem incompetent," she said. "I know," I said. "How do you want to handle it?" I thought about that for a moment. I thought about 37 years of maintaining a classroom. I thought about the 10 minutes of fear I had given myself at the kitchen table and then never returned to. I thought about Dr. Voss's 19-page report and the date Doris had written in her notebook. "Calmly," I said, "there is a kind of power that becomes available to you when you stop being afraid of someone's narrative about you." Dennis had constructed a version of me, confused, passive, aging, easily managed, that had apparently been convincing enough for him to bet a $1.5 million fraud on. That version of me had made him comfortable. It had made him careless. And carelessness, in matters of law, leaves traces. The traces were accumulating. I spent those quiet days organizing them. Franklin and I spoke every other day. I submitted a formal affidavit attesting that I had never verbally or otherwise consented to any sale of the property and had no knowledge of any such proceeding until September. Dr. Voss finalized her report, 23 pages in its final form, and was confirmed as the expert witness for the hearing. Claire, who turned out to have a highly specific competence in reading structural and property documents from her engineering work, reviewed everything in the case file and found 2 additional inconsistencies in the closing paperwork that Franklin's team then followed up on. Through all of it, Dennis and Kristen watched. I could feel it. The occasional unknown number calling and hanging up when I answered. The white sedan that parked on our street for 2 hours one afternoon. Watching to see if I would wobble. Watching to see if the casseroles and the quiet days and the accumulated weight of 31 years would eventually soften my position. I did not wobble. I planted tulip bulbs on Saturday and thought about spring. They came on a Sunday, which was, I thought, deliberately chosen. Sunday was the day I called Claire, before she moved in, the day of roast dinners and deliberate normalcy. I think Dennis believed that the day itself carried some residual power over me, some Pavlovian pull toward civility and the maintenance of the household peace. He rang the bell at 2 in the afternoon. He was alone this time. No Kristen. I let him in because refusing would have been, legally speaking, complicated. We were still technically married, the divorce filing having been initiated but not yet finalized. And because I was, honestly, curious about what approach he had decided on. The visits that are most revealing are the ones where someone believes they are being clever. He sat in the living room, not the kitchen, which was a deliberate choice. The living room was more formal, less intimate. The room we had used for guests. He had dressed carefully. The blue sweater I had given him 2 Christmases ago, which I recognized as a calculated choice. He looked tired and, I will give him this, somewhat diminished from the man who had stood in my garden 2 weeks earlier with a recalculating expression. Howard Bloom had apparently been honest with him about the strength of the case against them. He started with the past. This is a technique I had seen in parents at teacher conferences more times than I could count. When the direct argument is failing, you go to the emotional history. You invoke the shared investment. You remind the other party of what they stand to lose by continuing to fight. Dennis talked about our first house together, a rental in Gresham back in 1989. He talked about Claire's childhood. He talked about his own father's failing health, which was real, and which I did have sympathy for. He talked about how the stress of the case was affecting him. I listened. I kept my hands in my lap. I did not say anything that could be construed as softening. And then, when the sentimentality had failed to produce the response he needed, the second layer emerged. Peggy. He leaned forward. Howard has found something. In your mother's estate filing. There's an argument to be made that the transfer of the property to you personally, rather than to both of us jointly, was contestable, based on intent. I looked at him. Your parents' will didn't specify you alone. Howard believes that with the marriage already established at the time of the estate. My parents left the house to me, I said, by name, in a will that was probated in Washington County in 2007 with Franklin Greer as the estate attorney. The document is not ambiguous. Dennis shifted. Howard thinks, I would be careful, I said, about what Howard thinks he can do with my parents' estate. The sentimentality was gone now. In its place was something I had not seen very often in 31 years of marriage, a direct display of what I can only call contempt. Not the contempt of someone who hates you, but the particular contempt of someone who has decided you are an obstacle they intend to dismantle. You're 68 years old, Peggy, he said. This case will take 2 years. The legal fees alone, Franklin charges $400 an hour. Do you understand what this will cost you? Do you understand what forging my signature will cost you? I said. Silence. This isn't a game, he said, and his voice had dropped in a way I had not heard before, a lowering of register that was intended, I think, to signal a kind of seriousness that hadn't been present in earlier conversations. Howard is prepared to argue that you have shown signs of cognitive decline, that your testimony is supported, I said, by a forensic document examiner with 17 expert witness cases, a signed affidavit, property records dating back to 1961, and a neighbor's dated written record of unauthorized appraisal activity on my property. What is Howard's testimony supported by? Dennis stood up. At this point, Kristen's voice came from the front hallway. She had been in the car, I realized. She had been waiting in the car during the soft first act, and now she walked in without knocking. I had not fully closed the front door, a mistake I noted and did not repeat. and she stood in my living room with the composure of someone who has made a decision and is past caring how it lands. "Mrs. Harlow," she said, "I want to be direct with you. We have enough to tie this up in litigation for 3 years. The Cooks are considering their own civil suit against you for the delayed transfer. Your attorney's fees will exceed anything you receive in a settlement. The smart thing, the practical thing, is to take what we're offering, which is fair, and move on." "What you're offering," I said, "is the proceeds of a fraudulent sale, reduced by your legal fees, in exchange for my silence about a felony." I looked at her with great steadiness. "That's not a settlement. That's hush money." The mask, the professional composure, the careful positioning, came off in a way that was almost a relief to witness. Her voice went tight. "You're making a mistake." "I've made mistakes," I said. "Trusting your partner for 31 years was one of them. I don't intend to make another." Dennis said her name. She ignored him. "You're going to spend everything you have fighting this," she said. "And you're going to lose. And you're going to be alone in this house." "If I still have this house," I said, "I'll be quite content." They left. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt, my deadbolt, on my lock, and leaned against it for just a moment. My hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly. Not from fear, precisely, though fear was present. It was more the physical release of adrenaline after an hour of very controlled stillness, my body catching up to what my mind had been doing. I made a cup of tea. I sat down. I allowed the trembling to pass. And then I noticed something interesting. The fear, rather than expanding in the quiet, was transforming. It was converting, as it had once before at this table, into something colder and harder and considerably more durable. Every threat they had made, the cognitive decline argument, the litigation costs, the Cook civil suit, had been, from a legal standpoint, noise. Howard Blum was a good attorney, but he was working with a forged document, a fraudulent account, and a client whose guilt was documented in 19, now 23, pages of forensic analysis. They were threatening me because they were afraid. That realization settled into my chest like ballast. I called Franklin on Monday morning and told him exactly what had been said, including the cognitive decline strategy. "Good," Franklin said with the same dry directness he always had. "That will not help them in front of the judge." The hearing was set for 6 weeks from Thursday. I went back to the garden. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. What we had was a civil courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Multnomah County Courthouse. Plain fluorescent light, wood-paneled walls gone pale with age, and approximately 14 people present, including the attorneys, the clerk, the judge, and the Cook family, who sat on the opposite side of the gallery with their own attorney and the expression of people who have spent 6 months in a nightmare they didn't ask for. I wore my gray dress with the pearl buttons. Claire sat in the gallery 2 rows behind me. Doris Hartley had offered to come, and I had told her to stay home. But when I walked in, I saw her in the back row in her good coat, which made me grip my folder more tightly for a moment to keep my composure. Dennis and Kristen sat at the respondents' table with Howard Blum between them. Howard was a trim man in his late 50s, with a very controlled face. The face of someone who has learned to project confidence, regardless of what the underlying circumstances warrant. Kristen was in navy blue. Dennis was in the gray suit he'd worn to both of our children's college graduations. Franklin presented first. The forensic document analysis. The county recorder's timeline. The bank account opened in Kristen's and Dennis's names 6 months before the transfer, into which the sale proceeds had been directly deposited. A property appraiser who confirmed that Dennis had contacted him in March of the previous year, 7 months before the fraudulent deed transfer, requesting a private appraisal and specifically instructing him not to contact the homeowner. That last one landed. I saw Howard Blum write something quickly on his notepad. Then Doris testified. She sat in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap, and the particular dignity of a 71-year-old woman who has decided to tell the truth and is not interested in anyone's opinion about it. She gave the date, the time, and a description of the man with the clipboard, a description that matched the appraiser who had just testified. She produced her written note, dated in her own hand, admitted as Exhibit 12. Howard's cross-examination of Doris was brief. There wasn't much to work with. Then it was my turn. Franklin walked me through everything: the inheritance, the original deed, the fireproof box, my certainty that I had never signed any transfer document, never been consulted about any sale, never given consent of any kind. He asked me to look at the signature on the deed transfer and tell the court whether it was mine. "It is not," I said. "How certain are you?" "Completely certain. I have signed my name the same way for 50 years. That is not my signature." Howard Blum's cross-examination circled the cognitive decline argument without fully committing to it, implying confusion, questioning my certainty, suggesting that stress had perhaps affected my memory. He was good at it. But here is the thing about 37 years in a classroom. You know exactly when someone is performing certainty versus when they actually have it. Howard was performing. He had no positive facts to establish, only doubt to introduce. I answered every question directly, calmly, and completely. When he asked whether I might have signed something I didn't fully read, I said, "I am a former teacher, Mr. Blum. I have read every document I have signed for 40 years. That is not a habit I developed recently." Someone in the gallery made a small sound. The judge did not look up. Howard called Dennis. Under Franklin's cross-examination, Dennis was asked to provide the date of his claimed verbal conversation with me about the sale. He gave a month: April. Franklin produced our joint bank records from April, showing nothing consistent with a real estate discussion, and the plane tickets and hotel receipts from our Florida trip that same month, during which Dennis had previously stated in a deposition we had discussed the future of the property over dinner. "What restaurant?" Franklin asked. Dennis looked at Howard. Howard did not look back. "I don't remember the name," Dennis said. "What did you order?" I don't remember." "Mr. Harlow, can you describe anything specific about this dinner at which you claim your wife verbally consented to the sale of her inherited property?" The silence lasted long enough to be recorded. Kristen held up better than Dennis under questioning. She was more capable under pressure. But her account contained 3 specific inconsistencies with Dennis's that Howard had apparently failed to reconcile during preparation. Franklin identified all 3 and laid them on the record one after another with systematic precision. By the time Judge Carla Reyes called the afternoon recess, Dennis was leaning close to Howard in urgent, quiet conversation, and Kristen was staring at the table with the fixed expression of someone who has processed, but not yet fully accepted, that a situation has gone irreversibly wrong. Claire found me in the hallway near the window. "You okay?" she said. "Yes," I said. "I think we're okay." Judge Reyes issued her ruling 18 days after the hearing. Franklin called me on a Tuesday morning. I was in the garden, and I sat down on the bench under the oak tree to take the call. The ruling was 31 pages. The deed transfer was declared void ab initio, from the beginning, as though it had never occurred. The fraudulent nature of the signature was confirmed, adopting Dr. Voss's expert findings in full. The sale to the Cook family was invalidated, with the court ordering that the proceeds held in escrow be distributed accordingly. A full refund to the Cooks, with additional damages for their relocation costs and distress, to be paid by Dennis Harlow and Kristen Daly jointly. The property was mine, title restored to Margaret Ann Harlow, sole owner, as it had been since 2007. "There's one more thing," Franklin said. The district attorney's office had been monitoring the civil proceedings. Based on the judge's findings, a criminal referral had been made. The DA was proceeding with charges: deed fraud, forgery of a legal document, and financial fraud, the last carrying a maximum sentence of 5 years in Oregon. "What about Kristen?" "Named as co-conspirator. Her exposure is significant." I sat under the oak tree for a long time after the call ended. The tree had shed most of its leaves, and the light came through the branches in the particular way it does in November, thin and clear and very still. I had lived under this tree my entire life. No one was going to take it. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. Dennis's leverage was gone. His ability to threaten or obstruct had collapsed in a Multnomah County courtroom, and what remained was paperwork. He received the contents of our joint savings account, his retirement funds, and the furniture he had removed to the residence inn. He received nothing from the house, nothing from my parents' estate. I did not attend the finalization. Franklin represented my interests. I was in my garden. The Cook family was made entirely whole by the court. Melissa sent me a note through Franklin's office saying she was sorry and hoped I was well. I wrote back the same. They had been used, as I had been, and their culpability was zero. Dennis's criminal case concluded the following year. He pleaded guilty to deed fraud and forgery. The financial fraud charge was reduced as part of the plea. He was sentenced to 18 months supervised probation, a substantial fine, community service, and a permanent record that precluded any future work in financial services or real estate. Kristen accepted a plea on the financial fraud conspiracy charge. She paid restitution, lost her position at the insurance firm, and received probation. I will be honest. I did not feel triumphant. What I felt, standing in my house on the day the divorce was finalized, was something quieter and more durable. Something closer to the feeling you have when a window has been properly shut and the house is warm again after a long, cold draft. I changed the art in the hallway. I got rid of the kitchen table, not out of anger, but because I wanted a table that held only its own history, and bought a new one, round, from a woman in Lake Oswego who made furniture from reclaimed wood. Claire helped me carry in the chairs. Franklin sent a bottle of wine. Doris brought a casserole. The oak tree was bare, and the garden was put to bed for winter, and the house was mine, in a way it had always legally been, and now simply was in every other sense too. The spring after the divorce, I planted the largest garden I had ever planted in my life. 40 tulip bulbs along the front walk, put in during October at the height of everything, came up in April as though they had been waiting patiently for the right moment. A kitchen garden along the south fence, tomatoes, basil, runner beans, the small Persian cucumbers Claire has loved since she was a child. I put in a climbing rose along the back wall, pale yellow, the kind my mother had grown before she and my father moved to Clover Hill. I had never grown one before. I figured it was time. Claire took a position with an engineering firm downtown that spring and found an apartment 15 minutes away. Thursday dinners, Sunday farmers markets. It was the most time we had spent in the same city since she left for college in 1999. I rejoined the book club. I started a history reading group at the library that within a year had 14 members. I found that I had opinions about a great many things I had been keeping pleasantly to myself for years. In October, Doris and I took 2 weeks through the Cotswolds and up into Yorkshire. We laughed more in those 2 weeks than I had laughed in the preceding several years combined. We booked the same trip for the following spring. I found, quite good at being alone. The house held differently with just me in it, not emptily, but with clarity. I sat in the evenings with books and tea and felt consistently, entirely at ease. Dennis was living in a two-bedroom apartment in Gresham, where we had rented together in 1989. His record made the insurance career untenable. I hope he was present for his father's decline, because that part deserved kindness. Kristen Daly left Portland. I did not wish her ill. I wished her simply elsewhere, which is where she was. In September, I enrolled in a watercolor class. No particular talent, but considerable patience. The more useful quality, it turns out. By December, I had painted 6 small pictures. The best one was the oak tree in November, bare against a gray sky. I framed it and hung it where Dennis's golf photos had been. If there is one lesson in all of this, it is simple. The people who believe you are not paying attention are always making a very large bet on a very thin assumption. Know your own name on your own documents. Know what you own. Do not confuse kindness with inattention. If you ever find strangers on your porch holding keys to your home, smile, let them in, and call your attorney. What would you have done? I would genuinely like to know. Leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening.